Right, I've been asked about getting textures from Material Designer into Daz. I don't always do this. Sometimes I apply my own textures to clothing once it's in Daz, and mainly because I've got some downloaded textures. But I'll show you how to set up the UV maps and how you can get the textures across, just because it is useful to know. So here's a simple dress I've just put together. There's front, back, a neck piece and arm pieces. You can create the neck. I'll just give you an example. If I gonna do this, delete the neck. If you were to create the neck as an offset, so let's create a 12mm neckline on there. If I apply the texture to that, you'll see that the texture's single orientation hasn't curved around the neckline. So rather than create it like that, I would normally create a rectangle, put the texture on that's going across like that, and then sew it into the neck, and what you end up with is a texture that aligns a lot better. Now I'm just going to clone under to give that some depth. The reason I'm doing that is because it will add to the normal map. That bit of it. I'll put the I'll put some trim on the back as well. I'm going to offset as an internal line on here as well, but I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to cut it so that I can discard the 12mm section. Let's just check the length. A bit rubbish, aren't they? Convert them to curves. If I check the length of that section, it's 279 mirrored. So let's create a rectangle of 270 by 12. Create it a bit shorter, just so that it pulls in a bit better. You can see it's created the texture around the wrong way, but if I click on that, I can rotate the texture in Marvelous Designer, so it's vertical. That's better. Let's stitch that into the collar. There you go, and you can see again it's textured that wrapping around again. Sew that together. Sew that together. And I'll double up the thickness of that just to match the front. Let's just create my particle distance, lower my particle distance down a bit. Makes the curve a bit better. There we go. What I've done on this model is I've got I've got a ribbed trim I'm going to call arm trim, and then neck trim I'm going to assign to the neck trim. Let's just let's clone the neck trim and call it lower trim. Gone around the wrong way again. Right, so my lower trim, just going to edit that again. Put that around the right way. That's already around the right way. So I've created separate materials in material design in Marvelous Designer. So you've got your arm trim, which is just those pieces. You've got your body, which is your front and back material. Neck trim, front and back. Lower trim, front and back. So it's a fairly simple model. It's just created for demonstration purposes. If you go into the UV editor, now when you export a UV map, it's going to create a separate file for each square. You can try and optimize the layout of your pieces in the UV editor just to make it use a bit less space. There we go, let's put that around that way. That hasn't affected the direction of the texture, you've just changed the orientation in the map. That'll probably nearly do. Let's just move them. Oops. And then with nothing selected, fit all to 0, 1. What this does is it puts all of the textures for what I've got in this model into a single square, and I can bake the textures here. You've got an 8K size on your bake. Let's do it. Let's see what happens. Right, you can pick your diffuse, metalness, normal, roughness, and opacity. Just include the roughness on this one. I'm going to put these ones into a folder called Demo Text. Excuse what's already there. I'll explain that later. Right. Demo dress and save. This bakes the textures and any stitch you've got into PNG files, and it puts them in that folder. Takes a while. Takes longer obviously when you tick more of these texture types. You don't necessarily need all of them. Depends what your clothing includes, what the materials have in the way of metalness or opacity. Let's get to close that. I'm just going to that's okay. So I've baked my textures. I've saved demo dress just in case. And now I'm going to export it. You can export as an OBJ. I'll do both ways just for call it demo address v2, excuse that. So I've exported it as an OBJ. You can turn off the avatar. Single object welded thin. Include the UV coordinates. I don't need the maps because I've already baked those. And the maximum you can create the textures in this method is 4K. But right, your scale is in centimeters. For Daz, you've got X, Y, Z as your coordinates. And OK that creates the OBJ file. I'm also going to create an FBX just so you can see the difference and why I do it. So this will be my FBX file. Single object welded thin with UV coordinates. I don't need the maps again. I'm going to create this as a 2012 binary. I'm not sure which ones Daz can handle. I think if you create it as a 2020 binary, Daz has a little bit of problem, but centimeter scale again, and OK that. That's created an FBX. Now if I switch to Daz, there is a Genesis 8 character. And if I do File, Import, do the OBJ first, so you can see why I don't tend to use them. So you're importing at Daz scale. Got X, Y, Z as your coordinates. It's reading the UV coordinates. It's reading the material library. Right, so there's your dress. Now, if I look at the surfaces of the dress, you can see it's created a separate surface for the various parts of the model. If I go to Tool Settings and I go to the Geometry Editor for the dress, these materials, these surfaces, sorry, there's one for each surface within the model. Now, if you're just going to apply, say, a base colour to the whole thing, if I go to my, it's not really a problem because all of the parts all use the same UV map. So you can see it's come in the correct colour. It's shiny, but the problem is if you wanted to use a different texture on one of those parts in Daz, you've got some very badly named surfaces. You can rename them. I could call it neck trim 1 or something, and it would change the name here, make it a bit more useful. But anyway, let's get rid of that. That's a rubbish way of doing things. Oops. Let's change that back to now if I import again, but I import the FBX this time, there's a couple of things you'll notice. Number one is it's imported the avatar. That is the avatar it's imported from Marvelous Designer, so you can delete that. You've got your Genesis character. But this time you'll see that the surfaces match the names of the materials, so your arm, body, neck, lower. And then in Daz you've got arm, body, lower, neck. It's a different order, but it's, and here in the geometry editor you can see they relate. So for the purposes of applying textures it's a lot simpler, more intuitive. But if I take a preset, high array preset, and add it to the object, Right, if I pick up the base colour as being the diffuse from Marvelous Designer, and if I pick up diffuse roughness as being the roughness from Marvelous Designer, a little bit simpler, pick up the normal map, and that's the normal map from Marvelous Designer. And if I look at that as iRay, there we go. So it's brought in a pretty good version of the textures. If I want to change the textures in Daz, so I wanted the body to use some nice woolly texture, come on, right, so if I turn the base colour off to none to start with, if you change it to none, it just means when you browse again, it will browse from the last folder it was in. Right, if I go to a different material, now I've downloaded some materials. This one, Fabric 031, quite interesting. So you've got your normal, your base colour, which is base colour there, normal roughness. See, if I go normal roughness and browse, it takes me to the folder that texture was in. If I go to none and browse, it takes me back to the last folder I was browsing. So if I pick up diffuse roughness, which is the roughness, get to the normal. Change that to none again. Browse. There's my normal map. I've got a base bump map for this texture as well, which will be the height map. Let's put that up, and if I change the tile size, it'll scale the texture better. There we go. Did a bit more. Excuse me, peering around my phone, it's in the way of my screen. Right, that's how you add a texture in Daz. If I was to change the texture across the neck, because I created the UV map in such a way that the neck is a straight line, so just do the neck trim on here. Let's change the base colour to something else. Change it to a fabric that's got some direction to it. So there's a woolly texture. So choose the base colour for that, and change the normal map to the normal map. Let's change the diffuse roughness. To the roughness. Finally, I'm going to change the bump, base bump. To the height map. Then we'll change the tile size. Let's go to 20 again on this one. Now you see, because of the UV map, it's making the new texture I put in follow the line. Not a brilliant neck, but a woolly texture is not brilliant, but you can see it's following the line around there, even though the texture I'm using is not curved or created to match the curve of the neck. Because I've created in the UV map nice straight lines, it makes it easier to texture it. One tip you might want to use is, sometimes if your texture's got a flowery pattern or something, you might want to create these in the UV map and align them, just so that there's some continuity in the pattern when you put them into your model. Not always essential, but one thing to bear in mind. So there's a textured figure. Now the other thing I've been asked about is lighting. Daz by default will normally put a HDRI map into the dome around your model. If you draw the dome, you can see they've used a pretty blurry image for their map for the lighting. If you change your environment map to oops, not model materials, HDRIs. Let's pick one that's an outdoor. Is Venice sunrise. It's a nice one. There is a lighting model taken from HDRI. Don't know if she's on the floor on this one. You'll want to make sure you've got, you perhaps want a finite sphere of the ground. That just makes sure that she'll cast shadows on the floor. It bends the background a bit. One thing you might want to do is on your environment settings, change your dome radius to something smaller. It's taking a sphere, and because I've told it I want to map it as a finite sphere with ground, it blends, it squishes the bottom of the dome. Well, it squishes the bottom of a sphere to create a dome with a floor. But what you can see it's done is it's melded the floor into the walls, and that's resulted in distortion. If I change my dome radius, say 10, you see it's taking the distortion off the things in the distance. Still got distortion on the close bits. If I bring my radius down, say 5, there we go. The floor only extends 5 meters around my character, and if I visualize the dome, you can see it. Anything that is within that green circle is going to be the floor, and as long as there's no objects in the scene that are within it, you'll see they're not, I mean, you see a bit of distortion on the bottom of the lamppost. So if I bring my dome radius down a little bit, say say 4.5. Pulls it in just closer than that. It's one of the reasons you probably want to avoid using HDRIs that have got objects close, because they will be distorted. So there's one pretty good lighting. You want to make sure you turn off the visualized dome, because it will appear in the final render. You also find she's a bit of a monster. If we change the scale of the dome, the ground texture scale, 150 normally works quite well. So if I change that to 200, you'll see the effect. It's made the slabs bigger. It's also changed the point at which the dome hits the wall. If I turn the visualize back on, you'll see now I've scaled up the ground texture so I can increase the size of my dome as well. Bit of trial error. So I've more or less doubled my ground scale. If I double my dome size, there we go. A bit better. She looks a bit more scaled to her environment. Let's turn the visualize back off. So that's a good way of getting lighting into your figure, into your scene. You still got a bit of distortion because you are fiddling it a bit. Yeah, you're making a sphere into a dome with a squished base on it. But most of the time you can get away with it. Let's bring the ground texture down a little bit. There you go. It tends to blend in a bit better if you've not scaled it up too much. I'll ignore the lamppost. Not going to see it. You can rotate your dome if you want to. So if I wanted to spin it 180 degrees, so now we can see her with the sun behind her. Tone mapper for the lighting. Realistically, your shutter speed should be about double your ISO. So if I change the shutter speed to 200, and then change the f-stop to say 5, there we go. I've lost a bit of detail in the sky, but that is how you can light your scenes. Also put a bit of detail in the background. I've covered in one of my other videos how you can, things you do before you render. One of them might be that, oops, if I go back to my perspective, default camera, go to the top view for default camera, let's turn on depth of field. This f-stop doesn't affect the lighting of the model, just the focus. So if I make that so that the focus range covers the whole figure, back to default camera, you can see there's some blur in the background there. Don't think there's anything else you need to see. Right, the textures I'm using, I use this site called 3dtextures.me. It's got some free textures you can download. If you want to support the site and become a Patreon, it gives you higher resolution images, but this is useful for fabrics, for example. There's the one I've just used. And when you download the fabrics, they all come from a Google Drive, and you can see it includes the base colour, the height map I've used for the bump, the normal map, that's I've used for the diffuse roughness. There's just an image of what it looks like, and if you click on there you can download. That'll download a zip file that contains all of these. So 3dtextures.me is a good site. These are all free. You don't have to pay for them. A lot of these are good for clothing or objects in your scene. Maybe you want to put some alternative flooring into your scene. You can search this site. Say you wanted something for wool. It gives you some woolen fabrics. So have a look at one of these. Very nice for your models. So that's where I'm getting my textures from for my fabrics. If we go to Polyhaven, it used to be called HDRI Haven, but they've merged. If you look at the HDRIs on Polyhaven, this is where I've got my background textures from. If we look at an example, I've used an outdoor one with a sunrise in it. Mine's actually, the current one I'm using is Venice. Let's just let's turn iRay back off for a second. So this is Polyhaven, so good for HDRIs, and that about wraps up. Any questions, ask. If you've got any other tips you want, I do need some ideas, so get in touch.